Welcome to the latest episode of Jacobin's Stay-at-Home series. It's great to have you all joining us. I presume it's around lunchtime in the East Coast in the US, probably very early on the West Coast. I am Ronan Burtenshaw. I'm the editor of Tribune. Thanks very much for tuning in. The Jacobin Stay-at-Home series is usually on at 6 p.m. in the Eastern, and it's on most nights. So it's worth putting in your calendar and making sure you tune in to our future episodes. Tomorrow we're going to have Michael Lighty talking about Medicare for All in the US, and we'll have Toure Reed the day after on Tuesday talking about liberal anti-racism. But now we have Grace Blakeley. Grace works with us in Tribune, where she's a staff writer. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the Labour Party, the left in the Labour Party, the Corbyn project, and where we go next. For those of you who've been living in a hole, yesterday the Labour left suffered a significant defeat in the leadership election, where Keir Starmer was elected as the next leader of the Labour Party. This, of course, followed the defeat in December in the general election, where the Conservative Party, led by Boris Johnson, won a large majority. So the questions now are, what do socialists who've come into the Labour Party or who are previously members of the Labour Party and supported Corbyn through the last 4.5 or 5 years, what do they do now? What do we do now? What's the approach politically, and what's the approach with the Labour Party? Grace is the author of Stolen, a recent book that I very much suggest people check out, and is also the editor of a book that's forthcoming from Verso, which is Futures of Socialism, which looks at a lot of the questions that she'll be raising in her talk tonight. Before we go to Grace, I would just like to encourage people to get in the comments section. I'm going to be moderating a Q&A afterwards, so obviously, keep it kosher and civil in there, but get in the comment section of the live chat on YouTube, like the video, and subscribe to Jacobin's YouTube page. And without any further ado, I'll pass you on to Grace Blakeley.
Hi everyone, thank you Ronan for that intro, and thanks everyone who's watching for joining us. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit today. I'm going to talk about 25 minutes on where we're at as the Labour left as socialists in the UK. A little bit of how I understand the situation that we found ourselves in, and where we're going to go next. And so the main thing that I want to talk about today is just the tension that exists amongst the left throughout the global north, really, which is the tension between socialism and liberalism. And this is really a kind of dichotomy that we can use to understand a lot of what's gone on the Labour left, but also to an extent in the US or the US left over the last, particularly over the last decade or so, but also over a longer period. So, in most states across the global north, the left, what is understood and what is thought of as the left, is a coalition of left liberals and socialists. Now, I'm using liberal in the kind of classical sense, which I understand is slightly different from the way that it's used in the US, where it's kind of, a synonym for kind of left wing. But really, kind of liberalism is a philosophy that emerges with capitalism and is kind of inextricably linked to that ideology. I think the best person to read on this, if you want a really in-depth understanding of it, is Alex Zevin's book, who's written a history of liberalism by looking at The Economist, the magazine, looking at how the ideology changes as capitalism changes. So yeah, liberalism kind of emerges with capitalism, and as you can kind of tell from the name, it's premised upon a very particular idea of freedom. And this is an idea of freedom that isolates the political from the economic. So there's one sphere, which is politics, the sphere of kind of, rights, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, all those sorts of kind of canons of liberal philosophy. And then there's the economy, which is its own separate sphere. And this kind of separation is really fundamental to liberalism. There's politics and then there's economics, and you can intervene using politics in the economy, but ultimately this is its own self-contained sphere. And left liberals, because there are lots of different kinds of liberals, you've got free market liberals who you'll tend to find. I don't know when you lost me, but yeah, I mean, basically, I was talking about how we can understand a lot of what's going on through the lens of this distinction between liberalism and socialism. So yeah, I mean, my understanding of liberalism is that it's a philosophy that kind of emerges with capitalism. I suggest reading Alex Zevin's book on that, called Liberalism at Large. And yeah, it's premised upon a very particular definition of freedom, one that is based on an isolation of the political sphere from the economic sphere. And what kind of emerges from that distinction for left liberals is that there tends to be a belief that you can use the political sphere, so the institutions of the state, for example, in order to intervene in the economy to make it work better. So, you know, classic Keynesianism, really. Right, hopefully this will work. So yeah, as I was saying, again, just picking up on this distinction between liberalism and socialism and some of the kind of theoretical basis of that. So a big distinction here is again between idealism and materialism, and I think this is something that a lot of you will kind of relate to, is that liberals and left liberals in particular, this is often something that differentiates them from socialists, is that they talk about political change in terms of a battle of ideas. So you know, thinking about how to reform capitalism is a question of kind of debate amongst generally kind of enlightened elite individuals as to the problems that exist within the system and how those can be changed. And again, you know, there's no real conception of class, particularly not of class based in production, and of how class interests structure the way that capitalism works. So, you know, based on that typology, you then get a view of socialism which differs from liberalism in all of those major senses. So socialists don't see that clear distinction between the political and the economic. Capitalist states and like most other national and international institutions are run by and for the powerful. And socialists tend to be materialists. So rather than seeing history as kind of this battle of ideas between different perspectives, we tend to view the trajectory of history through the lens of changing class relations, and those class relations as based on changes in kind of the economic base, so on, the changing nature of production and of technology. And again, we have a view of class that is based in production. So one that centers the division between those who are able to basically own the means of production and those who have to sell their labor power for a living. So that is basically my understanding of kind of the difference between liberalism and socialism. And it feeds into a lot of what's going on right now in the left in the US and the UK and all over the world. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, what we understand as the left in the global north is very much a coalition between left liberals and socialists, between kind of social democrats and actual socialists of one kind or another. And what we've seen over the last 10 years, really, well, in the period since the financial crisis, is that the power of socialists relative to liberals has grown substantially. And that has, again, you know, coming back to this idea of history as something that's driven forward by changes in the material base, has been significantly driven by the changing nature of capitalism since the financial crisis, and in particular its inability to provide a kind of a better standard of living for in particular young people who've seen, you know, wage stagnation, productivity stagnation, unaffordable housing, in the UK, austerity, all sorts of things that are kind of eroding their support for the status quo, which has been a big part of why you've seen a bit of a resurgence amongst socialists in the UK and in the US and in a lot of those countries that were most severely affected by the financial crisis of 2008. So, you know, when Corbyn came to power in the Labour Party, and with the kind of rise of Bernie Sanders, you've seen socialists kind of I suppose, take a little bit of power away from those left liberals who were used to having control in the party machine, and actually from, you know, even like the free market liberals, particularly in the Labour Party, who are on the right of the party. But when that happened, we faced the problem that liberals retained power in a lot of different places, so within the Labour Party and outside of the Labour Party. You know, basically the entire ruling class is composed of kind of liberals of one kind or another, from free market to social democratic, who have this view of politics as one of kind of friendly debate between different sides. And that was really disrupted by the emergence of these socialist movements, who obviously have a very different idea of class politics, which is about building class power, and is a really kind of emancipatory political project. The other thing is that a lot of members of the Labour Party are, in one way or another, left liberals. So they're kind of nice people who want things to be better and have a kind of greater or lesser material interest in that being the case, but we're not as well embedded in the working class, in working class institutions, in working class life as perhaps we once were and could potentially be, which obviously kind of, again, consolidates to an extent the power of those liberals within the parliamentary party and within other parts of the Labour Party in the bureaucracy and in the media. And in this context, what explained Corbyn's initial success was his critique of austerity, and that brought together left liberals and socialists within the Labour Party, and also kind of in wider society, based on this critique of austerity, because both socialists and left liberals have this critique of austerity, which is there for different reasons, but joins up in this idea that actually, you know, this is something that we need to reverse and challenge. For left liberals, you know, there's lots of technical reasons why austerity, so austerity being the kind of reduction in public spending, particularly cuts to public services that we saw from the Conservative government from 2010. For left liberals, kind of, you know, there's a Keynesian critique of austerity, which is that, you know, it reduces aggregate demand and therefore reduces tax revenues and increases costs for the state over the long run. So it's self-defeating. There's a moral critique there that it's not right that these people should be the one that the working classes and the most vulnerable should be the ones who are paying the costs for the recession. There are all sorts of kind of, you know, broadly Keynesian or moralistic critiques of why austerity doesn't work that cohere left liberals and that brought them together with socialists. Now, the socialist critique of austerity was slightly different to that those things are all true. But for socialists, you know, austerity was an attack on working class power. It was an attack on the power and wealth of that portion of society forced to sell their labour power for a living, and a redistribution of that power towards the people at the very top. So reversing austerity wasn't just about making capitalism work better. It was fundamentally about actually building working class power to allow for a kind of change in power relations that would support a transition to a different kind of society. So with all that as background, we kind of begin to understand where the Corbyn project began to kind of fall apart, which is that there were a certain number of people who had a very significant interest in splitting this coalition apart. And there were lots of different ways that these people could have tried to split this coalition apart. You know, initially they really attacked Corbyn, because Corbyn had been this leader that had brought these different people together. So attacking him was always quite a good way of trying to break it apart. And they did so using the media. They did so, you know, using all their various different platforms, using their links with private organizations. And it's been a kind of relentless onslaught ever since Corbyn came to power, really based on an attempt to split apart Corbyn's coalition, to split the kind of angry socialists apart from the kind of respectable liberals who are supporting him, again, based on that critique of austerity. But another really significant issue, another real wedge issue that served to drive that coalition apart was Brexit, because Brexit not only divided the views on leaving the European Union, not only divided left liberals from socialists, but also divided socialists amongst themselves. It was really the kind of perfect issue that could be used by the Labour right to really split apart that coalition. I've just seen. Yeah, so we've got a clip of Clive Lewis talking about the second referendum. Yeah, that sounds good. You can play that.
The statement that's been made so far, there is some ambiguity to it, and it could ultimately be that Labour backs a public vote, but it's between Labour's options of Brexit and the Conservative Party's Theresa May's Brexit deal. I don't think that would be sensible. I don't think that would be a real choice. I don't think that would be a real option for people out there.
Yeah, cool. Great, thanks. So yeah, Clive Lewis was he was like a left liberal probably, but he was quite close to a lot of socialists. There were a lot of socialists that were behind his campaign to become leader of the Labour Party. He didn't manage to make it onto the ballot, but you can see him there talking about Labour moving towards the position of supporting a second referendum, which was, really the way that that the Labour right sought to split this coalition that was behind Corbynism. So initially, Corbyn came out after the referendum and said, the Labour Party respects the result of the referendum, and we did quite well in 2017, as many of you will know, on the basis that rather than Brexit being the central political issue that was kind of colonising debate in the press, in the party, etc., we were able to talk about policy. And we were able, and Corbyn in particular was able to kind of develop this left populist discourse that is, quite antithetical to particularly the right of the party and to liberals in general, because it is really talking about, taking on the interests of the powerful and redistributing power in society, not just, again, talking about ideas and needing to make capitalism a little bit better, actually saying, we're going to take on the billionaires, we're going to give power back to working people. And that was, a big part of why the party was so successful in 2017, along with the fact that the Brexit issue wasn't as significant because Labour had agreed to respect the result, and also in part, I think, the fact that there'd only been a certain amount of time for the media to really lay into Corbyn changed the dynamics between 2017 and 2019, when it had been 4 years of just constant onslaught. So obviously, in the end, after like a massive coordinated campaign that united left liberals, free marketeers, and really just a significant portion of the establishment, private businesses, the finance sector, etc., to have a second referendum. So to put the question of whether or not we should leave the European Union back to the people, after the kind of People's Vote campaign. After that, really just kind of became dominant, became the dominant narrative in the press, was whether or not Labour was going to adopt this second referendum position. For a whole host of reasons that I won't go into now, eventually several senior people within the Corbyn coalition decided that adopting a second referendum position would be the best way to deal with this. Now, again, I think, the moves by some people who are undoubtedly socialists towards this second referendum position speaks to the really deep-seated problem that socialists within the Labour Party have, which is, again, how to square this alliance with left liberals, because that is going to be necessary for any electoral coalition of the left. You're going to need to have some sort of alliance with liberals, and on questions such as the question of the European Union, there are always going to be massive divisions. So, this was a real and genuine problem for a lot of people within the Corbyn project, particularly because such a big portion of the membership was so keen on remaining within the European Union. And so eventually, we get to a position where the party is endorsing the call for a second referendum, and that's the position that the Labour Party goes into the 2019 election supporting. At the same time, Johnson's Conservatives managed to basically cohere a coalition of a very significant coalition on the right, which links up kind of working class, socially conservative, Brexit supporting voters, some of whom will have voted for Corbyn in 2017, with the Conservatives' kind of traditional voter base, which is, wealthier, middle class and wealthier individuals who may be slightly more socially liberal, but are still economically fairly neoliberal. So the building up of this coalition, which really hinged on a deal that was made between the Conservative Party and Nigel Farage's UKIP, allowed Johnson to basically take the entire Leave vote in the 2019 election, at the same time as Labour was adopting this position that was leaving parts of the working class who voted Leave, but who were, either socialists or left-leaning economically, leaving those people behind. So you had, again, this success at splitting this coalition, using that divide between liberals and socialists and using Brexit as a wedge to push that open, at the same time as you had the Conservative coalition becoming kind of hegemonic. And now with Starmer, what we're seeing, obviously, that election ended in a significant and resounding defeat for the Labour Party. And it has been used basically as an attempt to, despite the success of 2017, to kind of delegitimise even just the presence of socialists within the Labour Party. And what we've seen with Starmer is a victory for the Liberals once again. So Starmer has been elected basically on a coalition of the right of the party, many of whom are basically free market liberals, and what is called the kind of soft left, so social democrats, left liberals, many of whom will have supported Corbyn in the previous leadership election. And he's delivered a resounding victory, winning in the first round. And this effectively takes us back to a position where you have left liberals, so not a kind of Blairite, not a kind of, basically free market leader of the Labour Party, but what we would call the soft left, so kind of social democratic left liberal leader. And what will happen, well, what is likely to happen now is that socialists are really going to be pushed out. Starmer's, as I said, been put into power with the backing of both the kind of right of the party and the social democratic middle. He is likely to understand that his position is going to rest on delegitimizing the socialist left of the party and kind of cohering as many people as possible around this middle of the road social democratic kind of Keynesian vision that the centre of the party kind of represents. I think what's going to be interesting to see, and what we're already seeing, is the way in which Starmer's wing of the party uses the power that they have within the Labour Party. I think one criticism we can legitimately make of socialists when they took power is that, socialists have a very good abstract understanding of the way power works in society, of the way, material wealth links in with, one's political, economic, social prospects and power. But we're often not very good at actually using power when we're given it. And I think that can be said particularly of Corbyn, Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. There could have been, much more could have been done to consolidate the influence and the power of socialists as opposed to liberals. But in the end, the latter ended up having a significant amount of sway over the way that the leadership operated. This is not going to be what's going to happen under Starmer. Liberals, I would argue, don't have a very good abstract understanding of power, but they're often quite good at using it. Starmer isn't going to take any prisoners. He's going to make sure that he has, complete control over the party. And he's going to use it basically to try and kind of remove the influence of those on the left, and potentially using this battle against anti-Semitism as a mechanism to do that, which is again something I haven't talked about because it's a whole other thing, but we'll potentially be hearing a lot more of that in the days to come. So the problem we now face as socialists is, obviously with the kind of liberal wing of the party in control, there is a potential that we get forced out, or at least that our influence wanes such that there's not really a lot that we can do to kind of to shape the direction of the Labour Party. And a lot of people are now saying, a lot of people who supported Corbyn are now saying, oh, well, we may as well just leave, there's no point being in this party anymore. But actually, I do not think that we're in a situation where we're going to go back to the 1990s Blairism, very middle of the road, boring, centrist Labour Party. On the one hand, that's because of the success of Corbynism in changing the narrative on the economy. So, things like you're not going to get a Labour leader. Hopefully, you're not going to get a Labour leader supporting austerity in such overt terms as, say, Ed Miliband and another previous Labour leaders did before Corbyn. But it's also because, the reasons for the increase in support for socialism that underpin Corbynism and that underpinned Sanders' support in the US are structural. It's not necessarily all about ideas. It's predominantly about power relations, about the changing nature of production and technology, and how those changes influence power between different classes. And on that front, we're obviously still really living in the wake of the last financial crisis, and now we're slowly drifting into a new one, and one that is really kind of unprecedented in its nature, because it requires, the response to coronavirus requires shutting down huge areas of the economy. At the moment, there are a lot of economists who are saying that this is going to be a kind of, an initial fall in demand associated with people being forced into lockdown, and then the economy will recover. But that is highly, highly unlikely for a number of different reasons that I can't go into all of now, but I've written quite a lot about it. I've got a piece about it in the next issue of Tribune. But basically, there are some really significant structural issues in the global economy at the moment, particularly around the accumulation of corporate debt and also personal debt. And if you start to see a kind of ongoing decline in people's incomes and in corporate incomes, that debt starts to look unsustainable. Then you have to have not just more state intervention of the kind that we've seen now, so loans to businesses, support for the financial system, income support, but potentially wholesale bailouts of big corporations. And then you start getting into a position of, A, the consolidation of the corporate environment around a couple of massive corporations that are able to survive, and B, very, very close links between the state and those corporations. So I've written a little bit about how we could be entering this era of state monopoly capitalism. And obviously you can see how, the critique developed by the left of austerity and of, low levels of public spending and of a small state is not going to cut it in this age of kind of state monopoly capitalism, because we're not talking about a state that's too small. We're talking about a capitalist state that is potentially very big, but using its power to promote the interests of the capitalist elite of the bourgeoisie. So how do we begin to challenge that? I've again written a bit about this. We need to really start developing that critique of austerity into a critique of the nature of the state itself, the nature of the kind of capitalism we have at the moment, which is a highly concentrated, monopolistic and financialized form of capitalism, and really argue for the democratization of the state and of the economy, because obviously we're going to end up in a position where actually effectively, we have planning of one kind or another by politicians and the CEOs of big enterprises and shareholders in those enterprises and the financial system. The question is whether or not that those plans are democratic and those people are accountable to the vast majority of people. So, this is a critique that socialists, it's really only a critique that socialists can make. It's not a critique that left liberals can make, because they're kind of mute on this question of the state and of state power, because they see this really quite, sharp distinction between politics and economics. So this is a quite substantive critique that I think socialists are going to be able to make as we move through the coronavirus crisis. So, on top of that, that intellectual critique that we're going to be able to make, and that potentially kind of, recenters the voice and the role of socialists during this time, we're also going to have to think of new ways of building power. And again, this is a big subject in the book that Ronan mentioned that I've edited, that is coming out soon, called Futures of Socialism, is just quite how unusual the electoral success of socialists within the Labour Party, and to an extent within the Democratic Party, is historically, relative to the extreme weakness of the social forces that usually underpin the left. So the Labour movement, kind of various different kinds of social movements, working class, community-based organizations, a left media, on all these different fronts, we are really, really behind, and we have not really been able to build up power in these different areas of society as compared to, say, where we were 30, 40 years, well, 40, 50 years ago. So
a really big challenge, I think, for the left, as well as kind of holding on within these political parties, is to build power outside of them. So in the UK, we obviously have Momentum, which is a kind of an organisation that emerged out of Jeremy Corbyn's.
Would have been too big to overcome for the left. And so there are a series of questions facing us now, obviously. Grace appears to be back on at the side. I will just see if we can hear her again. Grace?
Hey, when did you lose me? Oh, yeah. Whoops.
I'll step off and hand you all back to Grace.
Am I still on? Okay, sorry. Something just... Yeah, I think that just started playing. I was like, what's happening? For some reason it started playing on my computer. Okay, God, sorry. This is really embarrassing for me and my apparently terrible technical expertise. Anyway, I was almost done. I was just going to say, so Momentum, this organisation that emerged out of Corbyn's first leadership campaign, that's potentially a vehicle for socialists to be able to organise both within the Labour Party and outside of it. And one of the areas that has really been missed and overlooked, I'm sure it's similar in the US, is obviously the labour movement, which really was obviously the foundation of the Labour Party as a political force, and is really, the major basis for the politicization of the working classes, and is obviously in a very weak position today as compared to 40 years ago, partly because of the changing nature of the economy, partly because of political attacks on the labour movement. So socialists really need to be organising within the labour movement, both to repoliticise the institutions that exist already and to make sure that the rank and file has a voice and a say and the leadership is accountable to them, but also to extend the influence of the labour movement within wider society. Another area, and this is a subject of a really good essay in this book, Futures of Socialism, is the media. So I think, we often underestimate as materialists the influence that the media often has, particularly when it comes to electoral success. And Tom Mills writes a very good essay about this in this Futures of Socialism book. Building up a new left media infrastructure is obviously going to be really important. You've got Jacobin in the US, and I think, you actually have got a very good left media infrastructure in the US. In the UK, we're so dominated by the BBC and some other really big broadcasters and a very, very right-wing press that it's been more difficult. But we have got Tribune, obviously. We've got Novara Media and some kind of good smaller organisations as well. So building those organisations back up again is also going to be really important, as well as getting socialist voices out into the mainstream media. On top of that, we're going to need to continue to organise within the Labour Party. And there have been a couple of really good campaigns that have emerged throughout Corbyn's time as leader that have campaigned within the party for the adoption of particular policies. So if we're thinking about, the policies that we really want to be fighting for, and it's realistic to be fighting for with Starmer as leader, then the main ones that really stand out are things like the Green New Deal, public ownership, and the kind of democratic public ownership, really. Kind of building on the success of those campaigns, things like Labour for a Green New Deal, and continuing to organise within the party to ensure that we are pushing for the continued adoption of those policies, which are overwhelmingly supported by the Labour membership, is also going to be another site of struggle from now on. I think another thing that the coronavirus throws up is this issue of kind of community organising and of having socialists embedded within pre-existing networks of solidarity, of community solidarity and support. In the UK, I'm sure it's similar in the US, we've had all these mutual aid groups spring up that are kind of helping people who want to give their time or resources, kind of linking them up with different organizations that they can work with or different people that they can work for. I think this potentially provides a real opening in the ideological foundations of neoliberalism, which pits us all as kind of, self-centered individuals going up against each other in the free market. If that, very kind of real and basic solidarity can be translated into a critique of our individualistic, competitive economic system, both a kind of intellectual critique, and also by getting socialists into those networks and by organizing similar sorts of things ourselves. I think that could be a really, really powerful thing for us to be able to do at this moment. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions. But I think, you know, one of the big lessons that we need to have learned from our experience of the last 4 years is just to really think about the differences that divide that strain of kind of socialists on the left and left liberals, and both, you know, understanding where those differences come from and thinking about how we can build a kind of more hegemonic coalition in these political parties without conceding a huge amount of ground in the way that Corbyn ended up doing towards the end of the project. So that's really the kind of message that I would give as to the difficulties that we've had over the last 4 years. But moving forward, I see, you know, we are entering a very, very different world. We're entering a really potentially a new era of capitalism. We can think of the last 12 years, the period between the collapse of 2008 and the beginning of this crisis, as one of those kind of lost decades or kind of ongoing periods of crises that are so characteristic of capitalism. Whether you think of, you know, the 1970s or the period between the Wall Street crash and the end of the Second World War, those periods when an old system is kind of breaking down or straining and a new one is being born. And I think the way that we deal with this crisis is going to determine, to a large extent, the kind of economic and political system that comes out of it. So it is really, really important that socialists are continuing to engage, yes, with electoral politics, but also building power outside of those institutions over the course of this crisis.
Great. Thank you very much, Grace. And thank you to all the comrades who stayed watching us throughout our technical difficulties there. You guys are truly the cadre group, the true believers of this project. Obviously, the party does not make mistakes like that, so we have to accept that there was some degree of Blairite sabotage involved in the technical issues that you all saw, and that will be resolved in due course. Before I go into the Q&A, I'd like to invite you all to subscribe to the Jacobin YouTube channel. Once we figure out where those gremlins have come from, and one of the three of us involved in this has been dropped down a well by Bhaskar Sunkara, the future videos, which happen from 6 p.m. usually on Eastern time in the Stay at Home series, will be on there pretty much every night live. So it would be great if you guys could be tuned in, could be sharing the videos, and could be subscribed to the Jacobin YouTube page. I now have a series of Q&A, a series of questions for Grace from the YouTube comment section. I will, of course, exclude your clever and accurate remarks about issues as the video went on, and focus first of all on questions about the party, about Labour. Patrick Timpson asked the question of what we expect to see now in terms of the membership. After yesterday's defeat in the leadership election for the Labour left, should we expect to see a large number of members leave the party? What will the kind of the membership look like in a few months? How left-wing is the membership still? Is it still something that we consider to, you know, broadly be supportive of Corbyn's programme? So what's your view on that, Grace?
I think there will be some people who do decide to leave the Labour Party, and that is kind of unavoidable. But I don't think it will be perhaps as significant as in the past. And a lot of it depends upon how people with significant platforms in the party are helping to make sense of this. So if everyone's like, you know, this is the end, we may as well all give up and leave, then I think that would potentially persuade a significant number of people who are on the fence to do so. But I think, you know, this is again based on the importance of this left media architecture. If there are people using their platforms to say stay in and fight for the continued adoption of these policies, not simply because the policies are important, but because it is critical to make sure that we are maintaining a coherent network of organisers like within and around the Labour Party during this period, during what is going to be a really, really important period. in terms of the development of capitalism, then I think people could be encouraged to stay. I think the really important thing that is going to kind of push people to deciding one way or another is what happens to momentum, because there are a lot of people who are quite angry about the way that momentum has become, you know, really quite deeply involved with quite narrow political issues, when it was supposed to be this broad campaigning organization and a very democratic organization that could kind of, you know, push or help support socialists in getting involved with various different campaigns within and outside of the Labour Party. I think what happens next to momentum, so how successfully it's able to shift from just being an institution that just supports the leadership of the Labour Party to something that helps socialists organize themselves and to organize themselves to get involved with campaigns to pressure the leadership, or potentially even, you know, to pressure people in the Labour movement to adopt certain policy stances, you know, getting involved in community organizing, all these different sorts of things. If momentum can take up that role and act as a kind of locus for socialists in and outside the party, I think it will potentially convince more people to stay. At the moment, that question is really up in the air. So a lot of people may leave in the interim. Yeah.
The next question we have coming in, and looking again at the party itself, is from Helena Rose, who asked the question of whether it is possible to reconcile the right wing and the left wing of the Labour Party in some kind of middle of the road approach. This obviously is part, at least, of what Starmer has suggested he's going to try to do. What's your view on its viability?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think it's not enough just to see the Labour Party as divided into right and left. I think we have to see it as actually a kind of three-way split between socialists, left liberals, and kind of free market liberals, basically. And Starmer has really been elected by the combination of left liberals and more centrist liberals, so that 2/3 of the party towards the most rightward end, excluding, you know, perhaps generously the 1/3 that might be socialists. So, you know, Corbynism was based on an ultimately failed attempt to bring together those left liberals and socialists, as I was saying. I don't think that attempt is definitively failed from the outset, just based on the nature of those two groups of people. And nor do I think that it is impossible to expand the power of socialists within the party by trying to actually re-embed the Labour Party as an organisation within working class communities, because that's really the only way to expand the power of socialists in the Labour Party. I think those things are possible, and that doing so could facilitate a shift from the Labour Party as dominated by liberals, which is what it is and has been for a very long time, potentially to one dominated by socialists and the left of those social democrats as well. But, you know, doing so requires a huge amount more organising than what we've kind of been doing over the last 4 years. Now, obviously, there has been so much to deal with that it's hardly surprising that, you know, we weren't able to kind of completely transform the nature of the Labour Party in 4 years. But I also think that, again, it comes back to this question of the left's attitude towards power and the left in power. I think I said, you know, I mentioned somewhere in the talk that we have a very good theoretical grasp of how power works in capitalist societies. We're often not very good at using it when we get it, particularly using institutional and political power when we're able to access it. And I think that was probably true of Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. You know, so much more could have been done to strengthen the influence of socialists in the party machine, in you know, democratizing the party, increasing the influence of members, all these different sorts of things that ultimately wasn't done. And there are a lot of reasons why that didn't happen. It's not just, you know, bad decision making, it's a lot of structural reasons as well. But that is really what is required to build and consolidate that kind of coalition that I was talking about between those leftward 2/3 of the party.
The next question we have is from Corey C. So Corey asks about Labour's position in terms of class politics and public perception. He says that a lot of his friends now think of the Tories as the party of the working class after the last election, and particularly some of the areas that they won seats in, whereas they see Labour as a party of the middle classes and of students. How do we combat that idea, particularly, you know, when it's being pushed so clearly by not only the press but by the kind of rhetoric coming out of the Johnson government?
Yeah, this is a really important thing to push back on. You know, the most significant trend associated with the engagement of working class communities and electoral politics is that working class people from about the 1990s have just every single election dropped out of the electorate. So there's a huge portion of people in advanced economies that just don't vote. The vast majority of them are working class. There's a whole load of reasons for this. In the UK, there's quite a good book analysing it called, I can't remember what it's called, but it's by Jeff Evans and James Tiley, called the subtitle is The Political Exclusion of the British Working Classes. And it charts the declining electoral participation of working class communities from about 1997 to 2017, I think, or 2015. And this was something, you know, in 2017, actually, turnout went up, and it went up particularly amongst working class people. Turnout down again in 2017. And I think that is really the challenge that we face in terms of electoral politics on the left, is how you re-engage working class people in politics when basically the narrative for a lot of communities is they're all the same. We voted Labour, they betrayed us, we voted for the Tories, you know, this time we voted for the Tories because they might just deliver Brexit, and that will give a big FU to the elites that have basically presided over decades of our impoverishment and disenfranchisement. So this is again why I think that social democratic path that Keir is probably going to pursue is just a no-go, because the only way the left wins is by re-enfranchising working class people. How do you convince people deeply pissed off and cynical about the political system to re-engage with politics? You have to provide them with a really profound and kind of combative, I suppose, populist message, which is about handing power back to people, not just kind of making the system work better so they get a little bit more handed down to them. So yeah, I mean, that narrative is, you know, it might be true that it is true that the Conservatives got more seats in what we traditionally understand as working class areas, so areas that have higher levels of deprivation. But if you look at the breakdown of that, not only is the substantial trend amongst working class people not voting, but a lot of the votes that the Conservatives did get were amongst people who either own their own homes, either with a mortgage or outright. And again, that's another dynamic that's really quite profoundly shaped people's stance towards electoral politics over the last 40 years, and in particular since the financial crisis, is asset ownership. And that really links into that question of age as well. So young people who've come of age since the financial crisis are less likely to be able to own their own homes, less likely to have private pensions, and therefore, in one way or another, less likely to support the continuation of a status quo that is premised upon ongoing asset price inflation. Whereas Thatcher's children and Reagan's children were turned into Conservatives basically by the kind of provision of home ownership to large swathes of people as house prices were rising. And a lot of those people who see themselves as working class but have a house that might be worth, you know, £500,000 or more, are the ones that have supported Brexit and voted Conservative now. And so I think it's important to account for those two things, which the press and most kind of political sociologists don't account for, which is the absence of the kind of disenfranchisement of working class communities and the influence of asset ownership in determining one's class identity.
The next question we have comes in from the very helpfully named channel name. So if you are channel name out there, thank you for your questions and your originality. Channel name asks whether the line that some parts of the left put forward about the impact of the media hostility to Corbyn is too reductive as an analysis for why the defeat happened in December. Is it something the left is putting too much emphasis on? Should we expect really and have plans to deal with media hostility? And is it something that there's a danger of focusing on because it obscures broader reasons for the defeat?
Yeah, so I think people who lean on this as an excuse for defeat are treading down the wrong path, because you're right, this is something that we can reliably and consistently count on, is that whenever a socialist gets even close to power, they will be utterly decimated by the media, whether that's the progressive media or the right-wing media. So it's not an excuse, but it is important, and it is something that we should understand, for a whole host of reasons. But there is reliable information that suggests that the media portrayal of leaders and of parties influences the way that people vote. And I think, it would be really surprising if the constant relentless attacks on Jeremy Corbyn didn't influence people. I mean, then, there would be less of an incentive for these people to be doing it anyway. And I think that is something that we really need to be able to account for. Now, the question is, what is the response to that? Because, often those on the right of the party have used that as an excuse to say the media is hostile. How do we deal with it? We have to give the media what they want. So we have to adopt the kind of Blairite strategy of just, basically giving Rupert Murdoch a veto over Labour Party policy. Looking forward, we need to be able to, A, develop left media organisations of our own that are popular, B, develop and train socialists to go out into the mainstream media, something that is difficult and has its own challenges, and C, come up with policies thinking about how to democratize the existing media. So in the UK, particularly the BBC, how could you use that the power that exists there and that is within the public sector to disrupt the existing right-wing media landscape? So I think we do need to think very seriously about the media. It is important, but to reduce the failure of Corbynism to, the media attacked him, is both, yes, reductive, and also it lets us off the hook, because we always should have known that, and we should have had plans to deal with it.
We got a question. I'm going to make a portmanteau here of a couple of questions, because there's themes coming up in the comment section, which is great. People should keep sending those questions in. We're going to push this a little bit beyond the hour mark, just to make up for the minutes that you lost in the middle of all of that. So a couple of questions joined together, right? Nizar Ezrora asked the question of what this means for Labour's relationship to the global south, to the military-industrial complex and foreign policy and so on. And the RPMD asks the same. What does the shift in Labour's leadership mean in terms of a non-imperialist or anti-imperialist foreign policy? Is that something that we're likely to see from the next Labour leadership, or is that going to be one of the casualties of the defeat of the Corbyn project?
Yeah, I think there's a widespread consensus that if Starmer holds on to any of the policy agenda of Corbynism, it will be the domestic agenda, the agenda on the economy in particular. I think there is a consensus that one of the main casualties will be Corbyn's foreign policy and international policy. And there are a whole host of reasons for this. I mean, foreign policy was one of the areas where Corbyn was most relentlessly and ruthlessly attacked by the British establishment. And it's obviously not hard to see why, because, British capital, as much as American capital, is so heavily dependent upon international imperialistic relationships for its profitability. I mean, particularly British capital, which is so internationalized and financialized. So there was always going to be a real resistance to, the kind of anti-imperialist, both kind of anti-imperialist political economic policies that Corbyn put forward, which are all about, things like technology transfers to the global south, a global Green New Deal that would support states in the global south to be able to effect a just transition, and also those more overt areas of foreign policy, like not selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. I think, these issues of foreign policy have historically not divided the free market liberals and the social democratic liberals in the Labour Party as much as they have divided socialists from everyone else, obviously based on the fact that we conceive of
the working class as international and as global, and as being more important than any kind of liberal conception of what a nation state self-interest is. And I think that is likely to be one of the ways in which Starmer departs from Corbynism, is basically by giving up on a foreign policy and an international policy that's based on solidarity with the global south, and move towards one that is basically the same as what the Conservatives have, which is like, give them a bit of money, don't worry about tax avoidance, arms sales, all the kind of incredible forms of extraction that facilitate the transfer of value from global south to global north. And I think that will step up, the kind of moralistic language about it will be stepped up in tone as we go through the coronavirus crisis, which is undoubtedly going to hit the global south far harder than it hits the global north, even if the virus itself kills more people in richer economies, at least initially. The economic impact on a lot of states in the global south is going to be huge, particularly when you think about the bond markets, and how it might become difficult or even impossible for some of those states to borrow money to be able to do the things that they need to do to combat the virus. So the response to that will be a kind of classic liberal moralistic thing of, we'll give them a little bit more foreign aid, without really thinking about any of the structural reasons why the global south is in a subordinate position as compared to the core of the global economy. And yeah, I mean, that presents real difficult challenges for socialists as to how we organize internationally. I think it really just emphasizes the importance of international solidarity for socialists. So making sure that we are building links with socialists fighting for justice in their own economies, and fighting back against the extraction from their economies from the global north. But it's going to be a really big battle. It's probably going to be one of the biggest battles that we'll face, and we might lose under Starmer. So that has to be something that we're thinking about as a longer term challenge.
So I see Nizar is enjoying my attempt to pronounce Azrura. Is that it? The second name? My Arabic is not up to scratch, so apologies if I managed to butcher that somehow. Thank you for those questions. The next one is Mike Begamery. So Mike Begamery asks what Labour's relationship should be to the Liberal Democrats now that Keir Starmer is Labour leader. Should Labour try to pursue some kind of alliance with the Lib Dems? Should it try to win over maybe more progressive, more left-leaning Liberal Democrats and voters? What should Labour's approach to the Lib Dems be?
Yeah, I mean, this is another issue that's always divided socialists and left liberals. Left liberals have called consistently for a kind of progressive coalition that brings in the Lib Dems and the Greens, and for the Labour Party working with those parties, basically to ensure that, to keep out the Conservatives. And this is something that a lot of people are now calling for. A lot of left liberals that were very supportive of Corbynism, but who were very anti-Brexit, were behind calls for a kind of progressive anti-Brexit, anti-Tory coalition. And they want that to continue, along with, big calls for changing the voting system, so for moving towards proportional representation. I personally, and I think a lot of socialists would share this idea, do not think that is a good idea. And again, it's because, partly the Lib Dems are a small party whose voter base is predominantly affluent middle-class voters who, if socialists are seeking to expand the Labour Party's electoral coalition, they're not the first people would be going to. The first people would be going to is trying to re-enfranchise those working-class voters who have dropped out of the electorate. And a coalition with the Lib Dems, who supported austerity, who were part of a coalition government with the Tories, who voted to increase tuition fees, who've done so many things to emphasise that their kind of, hostility towards the working classes in the UK, I don't think would be popular. And it kind of feeds into this narrative that you got in the 2019 election, which is Labour is part of the liberal establishment. I mentioned a little bit in there that, most of the British establishment are liberals of one kind or another, so free market liberals or kind of social democratic Keynesian liberals, and they tend to talk about things in very particular ways, the consistent disenfranchisement of working class people from political power by that liberal establishment has obviously generated a lot of resentment that's caused people to drop out of the electorate. So I think, you know, the optics, as well as just the kind of basic ideological foundations of a coalition between Labour and the Lib Dems would be really, really negative for the Labour Party. I don't know if that's something Starmer is likely to think about. You know, one thing that actually potentially, you know, gets us away from that is that there is this real strong commitment within the Labour Party, I think, amongst a lot of MPs and the party machinery, that, you know, if you're a member of the Labour Party, it's kind of a tribal identity, and you don't, you know, you have to make sure that you're not working with other parties explicitly. You know, it doesn't prevent coalitions potentially, but actually pre-electoral voter coalitions, I think, are generally off the cards for most long-term Labour Party members. So I don't know if that's something Starmer is likely to think about, but I kind of doubt it, although I might be being optimistic.
The next question comes in from Lauren Gilmore. I think this is the Lauren Gilmore from Scottish Labour, and if so, hello, Lauren Gilmore, and best wishes to you all up there. Obviously, Scottish Labour, for those not following, had its own difficult defeat recently with Matt Kerr, so we're all in the same ship, and best wishes. Lauren asked the question of what the left of the Labour Party could have done more successfully during this leadership campaign to try to bolster the vote of Rebecca Long-Bailey, and what the left of the Labour Party should do going forward to try to rebuild its position and ensure a socialist perspective in the party is maintained.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, during this campaign, the candidate backed by Momentum and the one backed by most socialists in the end was Rebecca Long-Bailey. Now, there were a lot of problems with the campaign as it ended up happening. I mean, first and foremost, no one, well, not that many people expected the scale of the defeat that we saw in December. So there weren't that many people prepared to kind of take up the mantle and replace Corbyn. Long-Bailey was one of those people who was being prepared for leadership, I think, but who at this point was probably not ready for it. And several other contenders actually lost their seats in 2019. So we were in the position where, you know, Long-Bailey was basically the only candidate who was going to get on the ballot and who the left could unite around. She was a little bit reticent to begin with, I think, about taking on that position, and it took her a long time to actually get into campaign mode, and then even longer to kind of put a team together. When that team was put together, I think there was a lot of uncertainty about what the campaign was about. You know, what was the message? What was Rebecca really standing for that differentiated her both from Keir Starmer and from Lisa Nandy? And for a whole host of reasons to do with, you know, the defeat in 2019, the people that were involved in the campaign, and also with Rebecca herself, we didn't end up getting anywhere near the kind of you know, inspiring campaign that Jeremy led in the first and second leadership campaigns. Basically, I think, you know, Rebecca was something and is something, you know, she's one of those people that really likes getting into the thick of policy, and she did so much to develop Labour's Green Industrial Revolution, but was less comfortable going out there and talking in really combative and populist terms about her vision for the future of the party. And for that reason, as well as the fact that Keir Starmer had been given a lot of legitimacy amongst many people who did vote for Corbyn because he served in Corbyn's cabinet, again, one of those decisions that I don't think was necessarily a good thing, although it was very difficult to find the number of socialists that you would have need to put in the shadow cabinet. But we did end up with a lot of liberals in the shadow cabinet under Corbyn, which has now lent them legitimacy amongst the membership. I think there are a lot of people that don't really know that Keir Starmer is not really a socialist and is actually, you know, being backed by a huge number of people on the right of the party. And again, Rebecca's campaign did not say any of that stuff. I think this is something similar that you've seen with Bernie, you know, him refusing to actually go on the attack and attack
Biden. You know, you had that again, I think, with Long Bailey and Starmer. But from the outset, Starmer was the odds on to win. And again, a lot of that is because he was so strong in the Remain campaign, and a lot of Labour members support Remain. So there are a lot of reasons to suspect, I think, that he would have won anyway. But I also think there are some contingent reasons about the nature of the campaign that gave us the scale of the defeat that we got. In terms of, you know, where we go next and how we begin to organise, I think, you know, one of the really important things, as I said when I was talking earlier, is thinking about the future of Momentum, because Momentum could, at its best, act as an organisation that allowed the left to cohere around some campaigns both within and outside the Labour Party, and provided us with a kind of consistency and kind of coherent identity that, you know, we're going to need if people aren't going to split off into a million different factions and leave and, you know, set up their own internal Labour Party groups. So I think the future of Momentum is going to be really, really important. I also think, you know, maintaining our commitment to all those Labour for campaigns. So Labour for a 4-day week, Labour for a Green New Deal, all those things that were so important in pushing those votes at conference last year. It's going to be really, really important to make sure we're able to replicate that success in delivering those conference votes in years to come. And, you know, the odds are potentially quite good because of how many members actually support those policies. So I think that's really important. And yeah, I mean, the other thing is obviously organising within the Labour movement, and making sure that, you know, Labour members, socialist Labour members, are also active in their union branches and are actually members of unions, because a lot of people aren't. So there are obviously a lot of mistakes were made and a lot of challenges moving forward, but the foundations are there, I think, and yeah, we just need to build on them.
I'm going to ask two questions now, combined, so you'll have to juggle between them here, Grace, and
okay.
See fit. So the first one is from Sir Patrick Brahma, who asks, what impact Starmer's victory is going to have on the class politics of left-wing Labour Party members? Is it going to drag people back towards a more middle-of-the-road or liberal perspective? And what should we do around the question of class consciousness amongst left Labour members? And then Harry asks what the Labour left strategy should be now that Rebecca Long Bailey has been left out of the senior positions of Keir Starmer's shadow cabinet. So obviously, historically, there's been when the Labour left has been strong in previous generations, there's been this question of, you know, campaigning to get a Labour left figure into the leadership positions, into what are known as the great offices of state. We now know that there won't be any Labour left figures from the Socialist Campaign Group in there. So what should the Labour left's response, particularly the parliamentary Labour left and the Socialist Campaign Group, what should their response be?
Yeah, so I haven't actually seen all of the announcements. Only some of them were up before we went online. But I was saying that actually, obviously, it's disappointing. It's not surprising, but it's disappointing. You know, Starmer, as I said, knows how to use power, and it makes sense that he would want to exclude some of those influential socialists from front bench positions. But it's not necessarily a bad thing, because we need a lot of those. We don't have a lot of MPs, and we need those MPs that we do have to understand that Labour should be a party that's embedded within the working classes, to be making that critique. And having a front bench position potentially limits your ability to do that. Again, that's often why you have seen more centrist leaders bring in socialists, is basically to kind of prevent them from being outside the tent pissing in. So, you know, those members of the Socialist Campaign Group who are no longer in the shadow cabinet, I think they need to be playing a really important role as leaders of the left in the parliamentary party. And it doesn't necessarily matter that they don't have front bench positions, because it does mean that they can play a role in talking to and organising members, and you know, engaging in various different campaigns and pushing the leadership to adopt particular kinds of policy. And I think it is really important that the Socialist Campaign Group does play that role, and really, you know, actually, because, you know, it wasn't really a thing until very recently. So I think, you know, continuing to expand what the campaign group is doing, continuing to make sure it's engaging with members, engaging with, you know, other institutions like Momentum, Labour Movement, etc., and organising things, and, you know, supporting things like political education amongst members is going to be really important in the coming years. So the first question was about class consciousness and how members are going to react to Starmer's leadership. It's interesting because on the one hand, there's always a tendency for the leadership and the demeanor of the leadership to drag members along with it one way or another, partly because, people want to be supportive of the Labour members want to be supportive of their leader generally as a rule. But I think there are also going to be powerful counter tendencies to that. And those powerful counter tendencies are going to come from the changing nature of the economy and the development of this crisis, which is, I think, going to potentially radicalize a lot of people, partly because it is going to, even after a decade of stagnant living standards, again, erode people's standards of living and potentially, reduce even further their waning support for the status quo. But also partly because, of the moves to, I don't want to say to the left, but to absorb the left critique of capitalism that we are going to be seeing made by the government itself. And, you don't want to be a Labour member and find yourself basically on the right of Boris Johnson. Keir Starmer does not want to find himself on the right of Boris Johnson. He does not want to be basically advocating the kind of austerity-like politics that we saw before Corbyn. And for that reason, I think, it's going to have to encourage Labour members to think, right, so what do we really believe in? What is our actual critique of the system? And what are our solutions? Because we can't just say austerity is bad, the Tories are evil anymore. We have to have a much more coherent critique. And if we're able to actually translate the confusion that is going on in amongst, the Labour membership, amongst society more generally, into a more coherent narrative through the political education that we have available to us, through the world transformed, through Zoom lectures like this or whatever. If we're able to start building on the changes that we're seeing at the moment and developing a left critique of the capitalist state, developing a left critique of capitalist of monopoly capitalism, and thinking about the potential routes towards intervention that the crisis playing out at the moment offers for socialists, and to having these discussions collectively, I think it actually could be a moment of quite significant radicalization for a lot of people on the left and in society more generally.
So we're going to move on to the last question now. Just before we do, I'd like to remind everyone who's sticking with us to go and subscribe to the Jacobin YouTube channel, as well as finding Grace's articles on tribunemag.co.uk and jacobinmag.com. Grace writes for us regularly there, and you can read her work through our websites. But just before we finish up here, we've got a couple of final questions. Again, I'll combine them for you, Grace. So the first one comes from Jane Middleton, who asked the question of what Labour's response should be to English nationalism. Particularly in the context where you've got a kind of national popular government in Downing Street under Boris Johnson. How should Labour respond on that question? And the second and final question comes from Samuel Barrett, who asks, what should we do now that the Tory government is breaking with some of the foundations of neoliberalism, is moving towards spending, investing in infrastructure, big responses to the coronavirus crisis? How should the left define itself if it is no longer a government and a right wing tied to austerity or tied as much to neoliberalism as it was? What does the left do to define itself in that political landscape? So I'll let you answer those two questions.
Cool. Okay, so how does the left deal with, the kind of spectre of English nationalism? This is a really difficult question for socialists to answer, I think, because, for two reasons. Firstly, there's obviously this divide amongst socialists as to what socialist internationalism means in terms of the support for or engagement with capitalist national and international institutions. For some, both the nation state and any international institutions are irredeemable. There is no possibility of parliamentary socialism. We need to foment revolution from below and not even bother with any of this kind of democracy stuff, right? I think that's now a kind of vaguely fringe view on the left, given the relative recent success of socialist engagement with electoral politics. So, you know, amongst socialists who do think that we need to engage with kind of democratic institutions, I think there is a difference between those who really, you know, focus on the nation state and, I suppose, reject more international, like bigger international institutions, like the EU, like the World Bank, the IMF, etc. And those who seek to use those international institutions as means for building international working class solidarity. And there are, you know, there's a whole debate, obviously, you know, particularly when you look at the EU, but it extends to other international organizations as to how the left engages with those questions and relatedly questions of the nation state. And this has played into the debate about how we deal with English nationalism, because there are some who basically argue that, I think, you know, to caricature, there are two views as to how you engage with English nationalism on the left. One is you ignore the cultural domain and you focus entirely on the economic domain, and you hope that you can radicalize people enough into supporting socialist policies at the level of the nation state, so that they aren't, you know, taken in by this kind of cultural, basically the culture wars. The other, again, it's something of a caricature. The other lens is to say, don't bother talking about the economy, build a progressive coalition of culturally progressive people, you know, centered in the cities and some of the university towns and, you know, wealthier areas, and play into the culture war. So make, you know, the Labour Party and the left the party of the good side of the culture war, as it were. And obviously neither one of those things has worked. I think we've, you know, historically tried both, and neither has worked when it comes to the question of nationalism. And I think part of the problem is, you know, it's not only about the left's attitude towards the culture wars, it's also been the absence of a really deep understanding of a narrative about the capitalist nation state. And the ability of socialists to use executive power to reform the state and the constraints posed upon socialist transformation by the capitalist state. Now, historically, within the Labour Party, that has been a really live issue. I think we kind of forgot about it during the period that socialists were in the wilderness, but I think we need to bring that question back, because that, I think, feeds into a lot of the responses, well, a big part of the debate about international institutions as well. And when it comes to this kind of question of the culture wars, you know, this is something that I don't actually have a good answer to. I know that's a sin to admit, but I know that neither progressive coalition or ignoring the cultural in favor of the economic works. The thing that I would lean towards would be to say that if you want to build support for socialism, which is both, yes, you know, economic policy that is building the power of the working classes, but also international and foreign policy that is attempting to foster links and support the power of working class people all around the world, then you have to start doing that by building up working class power in communities. So not by talking at people and saying, you know, giving this moralistic critique of whatever their cultural preferences, but actually starting by organizing in those communities, and kind of, you know, doing political education and building solidarity at that level, which again is something that the left has not historically been good at, and it's very, very hard to do, especially when those organic links that were often provided by the Labour movement between the party and those communities have faded somewhat. So that's a really, really big challenge. And I don't know what the future is of nationalism. Obviously, we're kind of living in many ways a heyday for nationalism all around the world. I don't know what this crisis is going to do for that. Potentially this crisis and the ecological crisis play into those nationalistic narratives by saying things are shit, we can't afford to keep our borders open, keep everyone else out.
And I think, the only way that we're going to be able to have any answers to those questions and have answers to appeal to the people that we're asking to vote for us is by organizing within those communities and actually, doing the kind of political education that we need to be doing. And then the final question, what do we do with a Tory government that is saying we're going to spend loads I suppose has absorbed some of the left critique, and particularly the anti-austerity critique that was developed by Corbynism. I think, I've written a little bit about this. I think the big question, again, coming back to that question of how socialists relate to the capitalist state, is about democracy. So, there has historically been this critique of socialists that they don't respect the kind of liberal democratic freedoms won by various different movements throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s. And I think that's much less true of today's democratic socialists. And there is a narrative to build which says that actually socialism is about extending the power of democracy from just the political realm into political economy more generally. So having an actually democratized state where you're not just electing people to tell you what to do, you actually have an influence over policy at the local level, the municipal level, at the level of the state, in state institutions, and also extending that into the realm of the economy. So democratizing corporations, having alternative models of ownership. So both kind of democratizing public institutions and also having mechanisms to make sure that there's worker voice in those private institutions as well. And I think that notion of democracy really needs to be central, both because the problem that we're going to see is this problem of state monopoly capitalism, so unaccountable elites planning the economy but doing it for themselves, and also because it's a powerful narrative. It's one that people respond to, because you're talking about taking back control, right? Giving people power back over their lives, which is really something that the kind of bureaucratization and alienation associated with neoliberalism has deprived them of. So I think that the left critique of capitalism from now on actually should really focus quite heavily on democracy and thinking about how we democratize the economy and the state, as well as making sure that we have more common public ownership.
Thank you very much, Grace, and thank you to everyone who tuned in, particularly for all the comments, which were excellent. Thank you for sticking with us through the sabotage campaign designed to convince you all that myself and Grace cannot conduct a Zoom call, which obviously we can, and that is a very unfair reflection on our technical expertise. I would like to talk a little bit about the Jacobin series, Stay at Home. First of all of you still there, go and subscribe to the Jacobin channel, like the video, get notifications, all the rest of that. The Jacobin series, Stay at Home, will continue tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern with Michael Lighty talking about Medicare for All. We will have Toure Reed on Tuesday talking about the pitfalls of liberal anti-racism. So stay tuned for those and make sure that you keep the audience up and tell people about them. Grace's new book, which will be out soon from Verso, the book that Grace has edited, is Futures of Socialism. So go to the Verso website and check that out. You can also find Grace's writing on Tribune at tribunemag.co.uk and Jacobin at jacobinmag.com. Both Tribune and Jacobin will have coronavirus issues out very soon. Ours will be better, but those of you who choose to read Jacobin's as well, I won't hold it against you. Thank you very much for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Thanks to all the people who've been working behind the scenes on this video, including Hale. And we will see you all soon. Thank you.